Nama Om Vishnupadaya Krishna Presta Bhutale Srimati Bhaktivedanta Swaminiti Namane Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Pracharne Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Paschachade Shatarne Sri Krishna Caitanya Prabhu Nityananda Sri Advaita Gadadha Shivasari Gaura Bhaktavrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare Vanchikalpatarubhyascha Kripas Sindhubhya Evacha Paditanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai Grantaraj Srimad Bhagavad Gita Ki Jai Shri Baladev Ji Ki Jai Shri Krishna Balaram Ki Go Premanande. So very good. Here we go, devotees. There's just one small section of the doubts of Arjuna, which we have to read through to complete that. That was the section from verse 37 to verse 43, in which he is complaining about how, if this battle takes place and so many people are going to be killed, then it'll be very bad for the family traditions. Destruction of dynasty, destruction of the family traditions and related considerations. Let's see as we go through. All right, so verses 37 and 38 are together. Let's just read the translations. O Janardana, although these men, their hearts overtaken by greed, see no fault in killing one's family or quarreling with friends, why should we, who can see the crime in destroying a family, engage in these acts of sin? In other words, well, you could say, we are better than them. These people are contaminated very badly. We don't want to fall down like that. So, Arjuna knows, of course, that he's a Kshatriya, and, well, he's obliged, really, to fight, you could say. Yes, he's obliged to fight. Prabhupada discusses this in the purport. But here, he's feeling it's beneath him. It's not really a Kshatriya consideration. One is meant to just fight for the sake of fighting. As we go on to into chapter 2, we'll see Krishna says that. A Kshatriya principle is just fight for the sake of fighting, not considering victory or defeat, just as a duty because you're a Kshatriya. You have to protect. So his argument, Prabhupada says, towards the end of this, it's just a very short purport for 37 and 38. Prabhupada said, obligation is actually binding when the effect is good, but when the effect is otherwise, then no one can be bound. Well, that's a sort of a consideration, but it's not a real Kshatriya consideration. Otherwise, you'd have all these Kshatriyas trying to figure out if it's really for good or for bad. But for the Kshatriyas, the point is, do your duty. Do your duty. So, yeah. So this is the essence of what Arjuna is complaining about in this verse, Srila Prabhupada makes a comment. It's actually in a class on these verses, on these same verses, in London in Bhaktivedanta Manor, 1973. Just listen to this. Jiridan's party were not considering all these pious or impious, sinful or vicious activities because loba upahata cetasa. They have lost their good sense. They have lost their good sense. That's in verse 37. Loba upahata cetasa. They've lost their sense on account of greediness for acquiring the empire. It's true. It's definitely true. They were very greedy. They didn't have the right, but they were just so attached. They just carried on. So they had lost their sense on account of greediness. And Prabhupada continues, when one is overcome by lust or greed, he loses all intelligence. Therefore, Arjuna is considering so many things because he's a devotee. You know, you get here, we mention the principle throughout these verses from, 26 or 27 through to the end of the chapter. There's some overlapping in thinking between just straightforward Kshatriya Dharma and certain considerations based on the sensitivity of a devotee. And Srila Prabhupada, we read last time, Prabhupada was actually appreciating, in a certain sense, not absolutely, but he was saying that actually it is a sign of the good nature of Arjuna that he was concerned, he was worried. Although, as we know, and we'll start seeing in the course of our program just now, that Krishna basically doesn't appreciate. Even though from a certain perspective, with certain considerations borne in mind, it may be good, but on the absolute platform, the Supreme Personality of Godhead rejects these types of ideas. So Prabhupada continues here. Arjuna said, Katam nagyayam asmabi. By us means including Krishna. He's saying not I or by me, he's including Krishna. You're on this side because you're on my side. You're my charioteer. If I do not consider all these things, what will people say? That Arjuna is such a great devotee of Krishna, and Krishna is there, but Arjuna is committing such sinful activities. So it's a real clash of principles, Kshatriya principles, and certain types of Krishna conscious principles, which are sometimes defective. We mentioned his considerations about aggressors. Don't kill these people, even though they are aggressors. But actually the principle is, if people are aggressors, they must be killed. So it's really just a weakness and not really sensitivity to right and wrong. Anyway, Arjuna's really in a mixed up state. So let us go on now to verse 39. Further considerations about destruction of dynasty and family. When the elders die, traditional purifying activities may stop. So, anyway, he says, With the destruction of the dynasty, the eternal family tradition is vanquished, and thus the rest of the family becomes involved in irreligion. So Srila Prabhupada, of course, discusses in the purport that in Varnashram, there are different types of principles to help the family members develop nicely. The elder members are responsible for purifying processes, different types of religious performances, different types of religious performances, and like that. So if the older members die, if the dynasty is destroyed, then the younger people who are left, what are they going to do? They won't know what to do, and therefore it's very likely they'll become irreligious. The tradition will break down. So the elders must be protected. That's the point in verse 39. Then in verse 40, when irreligion is prominent in the family, O Krishna, the women of the family become polluted, and from the degradation of womanhood, O descendant of Vrishni, comes unwanted population, Varna Sankara, unqualified population. So Prabhupada explains in the purport, good population is the basic principle for peace. Varnashram is there so that good population will be there. But that good population being there depends on qualified ladies being there. If the ladies become degraded, and just get mixed up with any sort of men, whoever, men of low principle, then the children will become unqualified. Well, first of all, unqualified children will be born. And because the mothers are so vital in the proper upbringing of their children, then if the women are polluted, the children are degraded, then the children, it's just going to be a very bad situation. So therefore, protection is required for the women so they don't get misled, and then the bad population gets born, and then the women are not able to look after those children properly, and the children don't want to be looked after properly. Yes, so women should always be protected. And according to the Varnashram system, it's like that. The whole program is designed, you could say, to facilitate their chastity and devotion, and thereby get good population. Otherwise, as Arjuna says, it's kind of a famous line, Jayate Varna Sankara, which literally can be taken to mean that unwanted population will come into being. Jayate also means victory. So it's possible to translate that, Jayate Varna Sankara, to mean that the Varna Sankara, the unqualified children who are just crazy little children, almost like animals, those unwanted children will be victorious, and the whole society, they'll dominate the society. And that's what we have nowadays, frankly, in Western society, if not all over the world. So on a certain level, it's a good point. On another level, Krishna isn't really going to protect it. I mean, isn't really going to appreciate, as if like there are other ways of dealing with that. We have a special question here. It's based on this verse 40, which we just read right now. And there's a verse which is referenced. It's Srimad Bhagavatam 7:15-12. 7:15-12. And you're going to be asked a question about this, probably. So in that verse, this is what the verse says. There are 5 branches of irreligion, appropriately known as irreligion, vidharma, religious principles for which one is unfit, paradharma, pretentious religion, abhas dharma, analogical religion, upadharma, and cheating religion, chala dharma. One who is aware of real religious life must abandon these 5 as irreligious. So that's 7:15-12. And you are going to be asked a question. This is the question. So this verse was mentioned, 7:15-12, pertaining to the 5 branches of irreligion. The first 2 are irreligion and religious principles for which one is unfit. What are the remaining 3? So we'll leave that up to you. You figure that out. So we go on to 41. Let's read the translation. An increase of unwanted population certainly causes hellish life, both for the family and for those who destroy the family tradition. The ancestors of such corrupt families fall down because the performances for offering them food and water are entirely stopped. So this is referring to the sort of Pitapak type of ceremony, pinda, offering of oblations and whatever to the ancestors. Prabhupada discusses all of this, of course, in the purport, and he makes the point that some of the ancestors are suffering from sinful reactions. Some can't get gross bodies, maybe they're just ghosts. But when they're offered things nicely in such ceremonies, like if they're offered prasadam in such ceremonies and other things, then they get released from those situations. So, Prabhupada does explain in the purport that this is more for, Prabhupada says, those who are not in devotional life are required to perform such rituals. One who's engaged in the devotional life is not required to perform such actions. Simply by performing devotional service, one can deliver hundreds and thousands of forefathers from all kinds of misery. So, like we said, coming up in the next chapter, Krishna is going to say that no, we will not do what you're saying we must do. We'll overlook these things and carry on in Krishna consciousness. In other words, Krishna has other ideas how these defects can be addressed. This defect of the forefathers not being given certain offerings or whatever, and therefore not escaping their sinful reactions, that can be overcome by the family practicing Krishna consciousness, and the ancestors get to share the benefits of that. And Prabhupada quotes the Bhagavatam 11.541. Anyone who's taken shelter of the lotus feet of Mukunda, the giver of liberation, giving up all kinds of obligation, and has taken to the path in all seriousness, owes neither duties nor obligations to the demigods, sages, general living entities, family members, humankind, or forefathers. And Srila Prabhupada makes a comment. Let's read this. In a class, again, it's a class on this specific verse in Bhaktivedanta Manna, 1973. At the present moment, nobody knows that after death there is life, and still such life is connected with the family, the forefathers and the descendants. Nothing of this science is known at the present moment. More or less exactly like animals. An animal has no such feelings of connections, simply the number of days he will eat. He will eat, sleep, have sex life, and die, that's all. This subtle regulation of family connection is unknown at the present moment, and still they're very proud of advancement in knowledge. Arjuna was not a Brahmin, nor a sannyasi, nor a grihasta. Oh well, anyway. He's on the battlefield. He's not a Vedantist. Just see how his knowledge is perfect. This is Vedic culture. At the present moment, they're reading Bhagavad Gita for years and years, important scholars, important theologians, and they cannot understand. Okay, so there's a couple more verses here on this particular point. Here's number 42. 42. Let's just have a look here. By the evil deeds of those who destroy the family tradition and thus give rise to unwanted children, all kinds of community projects and family welfare activities are devastated. Prabhupada, anyway, Prabhupada makes some comments there. But there's one comment I want to read from Prabhupada's class on this verse in the Manor in 1973. In Calcutta, there was an eminent scientist. His name was Sarpisidat or something. He was a confirmed atheist. He was saying that this offering to the forefathers by offering pinda, prasad, and water, it will go to my forefather. So just give me to eat downstairs, whether I can eat upstairs. So just give me to eat downstairs, whether I can eat upstairs. Such reasoning, but he does not know that there are different types of eating. They do not know there is eating in the subtle body also. The ghosts there also eat, but the method is different. In other words, even someone is in a ghostly form, they will be able to partake at least of Krishna Prasad and be benefited. And finally, 43, O Krishna, maintainer of the people, I've heard by disciplic succession that those whose family traditions are destroyed dwell always in hell. So then finally, verse 46, Shri Shri Radharatnath Shri Giri Govardhan Shri Caitanya Mahaprabhu Ki Jai. Sanjaya said, Arjuna, having thus spoken on the battlefield, cast aside his bow and arrows and sat down on the chariot, his mind overwhelmed with grief. Hare Krishna. So that's the end of the first chapter. Let us go on to the second chapter. Let us read a little summary here. in the last paragraph of the last verse in chapter 2. It's verse 72. It's a big chapter. Somehow we'll try and get through this week. So in the last paragraph of the last purport, Prabhupada says, Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur has summarized the second chapter of the Bhagavad Gita as being the contents for the whole text. In the Bhagavad Gita, the subject matters are Karma Yoga, Jnana Yoga, and Bhakti Yoga. In the second chapter, Karma Yoga and Jnana Yoga have been clearly discussed, and a glimpse of Bhakti Yoga has also been given as the contents for the complete text. So that's a very important point. And of course, we note the title of the chapter is Contents of the Gita Summarized. Yeah. And let's just run through the different subject matters which are discussed or mentioned, at least, sort of introduced in this chapter, which are then going to be discussed in more detail later on. So let's just point out those right now. If you like, you can make a note of them. So here is going to be discussed about the nature of the soul, which of course is going to be discussed here and there in different places throughout Bhagavad Gita. But here in the second chapter of the soul, reincarnation, and that is discussed in verses 13, 22, and 27. Transmigration 13, 22, and 37. Then Karma Kandya is discussed very strongly. Arjuna's duties as a Kshatriya, according to Karma Kandya, they're discussed very strongly from verse 31 through to verse 37. Then Karma Yoga is discussed. Karma Yoga from verse 38 to verse 53, a major discussion about Karma Yoga as distinct from Karma Kandya. We will explain the difference as we go. Then the use of intelligence and what facilitates intelligence is discussed in verses 41 and 44. They're having, 41 and 44, that's a fact. Let me just note one other thing. In regards to transmigration, there's discussion related to transmigration, very important also, in verse 40. Why don't you note that down? Also in verse 40, famous verse, which is dealing with transmigration. Okay. Then the Vedas. The Vedas are discussed in verses 42 and 43, then verse 45, and then verse 53. I mean, there may be some mention here and there elsewhere also, but these are like, you get fairly focused discussion on the Vedas, verses 42 and 43, then 45, then 53. Then the modes of material nature. The modes of material nature are discussed in verse 45. Important discussion. Then Bhakti Yoga, devotional service, is mentioned, it's introduced in verses 49 to 51, then verse 61 and verse 64. 49 to 51, then 61, then 64, and then discussion of sense control takes place from verse 54 to verse 72. All sorts of perspectives on sense control. Very important and very interesting also. So pretty much everything, or the main subjects which are discussed throughout Bhagavad Gita are introduced here, but briefly, not extensively. That will come as we go through. All right, so now let's have a look here. These are the sections that we are going to, we're going to go through here and there, focusing on these different sections. There are 5 sections. The first one is from verse 1 to verse 10. And what we've called that is more doubts, but Arjuna starts to surrender. He presents more doubts left over from chapter 1. Yeah. But then he starts to sort of, Krishna begins to preach to him, actually, just begins. And Arjuna starts to surrender. So verse 1 to verse 10. Then the second section is Gyan, the knowledge about the soul, from verse 11 to verse 30. And there's a number of important verses there, some famous verses. Then the third section is Karma Kandya, from verse 31 to 37. And that's Krishna telling Arjuna, come on, you're a Kshatriya. You have no choice. You got to fight, because it's your duty according to Varnashram, means it's your duty according to Karma Kandya. Otherwise, don't say you're a Kshatriya. Fourth section is Buddhi Yoga, or the introduction to Karma Yoga. An introduction to Karma Yoga, which is referred to here also as Buddhi Yoga, meaning the yoga of intelligence. And then the last section, from verse 54 to 72, is, we said just a few minutes ago it's about sense control. That's a fact. We've called it samadhi, how to really reach a really elevated state of consciousness, a very deep focus, deep absorption on the transcendental platform. Okay, so there you go. And now let us go into the first section from verse 1 to verse 10. And like we just told you, we call it further doubts, Arjuna's further doubts, and the beginning of his surrender. So particularly, just for your information, from verse 5 to verse 9, particularly, verse 5 to verse 9, Arjuna introduces or reintroduces, basically. There are no really new complaints, but he just again presents some of the same complaints pretty much from verse 5 to verse 9. So anyway, but let's get started here. Verse 1, Sanjay said, seeing Arjuna full of compassion, his mind depressed, his eyes full of tears, Madhusudan, Krishna, spoke the following words. So you may remember we just read several minutes ago the last verse of chapter 1, which was also spoken by Sanjaya to Dhritarashtra. And again, he was talking about Arjuna's bad condition, his very bad condition, right at the end there of chapter 1, that he just threw aside his bow and arrows, and he just sat down, overwhelmed with grief. What can you say? It's a bad show. So Sanjay now speaks this verse, and we can imagine Dhritarashtra must have been quite happy to hear these things. However, Sanjaya, he has deeper insight into all these things. And he sort of, expresses it a little subtly here and there. So he does that also, so that even though Dhritarashtra may be a bit happy to hear that Arjuna is in such a kind of pathetic state, particularly for a Kshatriya, it's just a terribly pathetic state. But Sanjay, in speaking about Krishna, Sanjay addresses Krishna. He says, Uvacha Madhusudana. Madhusudana is another name of Krishna, like we've said in different places in the first chapter. Krishna was addressed by different names, which were relevant in terms of the very immediate circumstances when those names were used. And here it's the same thing. Madhusudana is a name of Krishna, which means that he was the one who killed the Madhu demon. Way back at the beginning of creation, there was this Madhu demon who was a real monster. Sure, he was just terrible, but Krishna killed him. So like that, Sanjay is very subtly saying that, well, Krishna's there, and he kills even these heavy demons. So we can expect that some of your people are going to get killed, probably a lot of them. Yeah, and Prabhupada explains in the purport that as Krishna killed the Madhu demon, Krishna is now, he's going to start now, but then he's going to go on, and he's going to really kill all the doubts of Arjuna. Yes. And Prabhupada makes important points, sort of getting into the middle of the paragraph of the purport, that Arjuna was compassionate, but not really in the right way. He was concerned about the bodies of his relatives and others, And Prabhupada says here in the purport, no one knows where compassion should be applied. Compassion for the dress of a drowning man is senseless. A man fallen in the ocean of nescience cannot be saved simply by rescuing his outer dress. One who doesn't know this and laments for the outward dress is called a Sudra, or one who laments unnecessarily, and Arjuna was a Kshatriya. So Kshatriyas, they're twice born. They're spiritually conscious people. They're not meant to lament like this. Yeah. So Krishna is going to deliver Arjuna from this, and he's going to deliver us too. Yes, because we, for so many lifetimes, have been on that level. And Prabhupada says at the end of the purport there, this chapter instructs us in self-realization by an analytical study of the material body and the spirit soul, as explained by the Supreme Authority, Lord Sri Krishna. This realization is possible when one works without attachment to fruitive results and is situated in the fixed conception of the real self. This is a theme which is going to be coming up repeatedly, actually throughout the book, but particularly in the first 6 chapters. Particularly, it's just going to repeatedly come up that we must become self-realized by understanding what's the situation, body and soul, and then we must work without attachment to fruitive results, being fixed in that conception. So, right, let's go on now, verse 2. And Krishna, it's not exactly the first time Krishna has spoken. He has actually spoken very briefly in chapter 1. But this is really the first time Krishna is going to give like a real instruction. He's going to really point out something to Arjuna really strongly. So the Supreme Personality of Godhead said, "My dear Arjuna, how have these impurities come upon you? They're not at all befitting a man who knows the value of life. They lead not to higher planets, but to infamy." So Sri Bhagavan Uvacha, Krishna is speaking, the Supreme Personality of Godhead. And Prabhupada, it's quite a substantial purport here, actually, this purport for chapter 2, verse 2. And Prabhupada discusses, first of all, he discusses about the use of the term Bhagavan. That this term, Bhagavan, is used in general. Here it's being used whenever Krishna speaks, whenever he speaks. But in general, the term Bhagavan is used to identify the supreme absolute truth, the ultimate. Prabhupada says, the ultimate in the absolute truth. And Prabhupada quotes famous verse from the 2nd chapter of the 1st canto of Srimad Bhagavatam, Vedanti tatat vavidas, tattvam yajnanam advayam, brahmeti paramatmeti, Bhagavan iti shabjate. The absolute truth is realized in 3 phases of understanding by the knower of the absolute truth. And all of them are identical. Such phases of the absolute truth are expressed as Brahman Paramatma and Bhagavan. So Srila Prabhupada, in the purport here, he explains about the three. Brahman is the impersonal, all-pervasive spirit, or even you could say the spiritual energy, impersonal spiritual energy, which just is spread out everywhere, the Brahma Jyoti. Paramatma is the localized aspect within the heart of every living entity in the material world, and even within every atom. And then Bhagavan is the Supreme Lord himself. Yes, so in the translation of that verse, Bhagavatam verse that Prabhupada's given, it's a little different from the translation you'll find in the Bhagavatam, but he does, one interesting thing he says is, they're all identical. Well, the thing is, they're all part of Krishna's nature. As it's put, I was told by Jiva Goswami, but anyway, as it is put, we've heard. What is Brahman? Brahman is Krishna, minus his form and minus his personality. If you have Krishna and you take away his form and you take away his personality, what you're left with is Brahman, his spiritual energy, his effulgence. So then what is Paramatma? Paramatma is Krishna with his form. Form is there, but minus his personality. His personality as the Supreme Lord Krishna in Goloka Vrindavan, he's got quite a personality. But as Paramatma, he's just managing things. You could say in a very emotionless way, without getting involved on a personal level. So Paramatma is Krishna with his form, but minus his personality. And then Krishna, or Bhagavan, is Krishna, obviously, with his form and with his personality. So they're all part. They're all just different ways, you could say, of looking at the same thing or same person, Krishna. But still they can be understood in different ways. This is all achintya bhed abhed tattva. There's oneness, but there's difference. So in the purport, like we said, it's a fairly extensive purport. First paragraph, Prabhupada discusses Brahman, Paramatma, Bhagavan. Second paragraph, Srila Prabhupada differentiates between these three features by giving the example of the sun. Prabhupada says, right at the beginning of the second paragraph, these three divine aspects can be explained by the example of the sun, which also has three different aspects, namely the sunshine, the sun's surface, and the sun planet itself. One who studies the sunshine only is the preliminary student. One who understands the sun's surface is further advanced, and one who can enter into the sun planet is further advanced. You know, Prabhupada gives a slightly different explanation of exactly the same example elsewhere. Prabhupada talks about the sunshine, then the sun planet, then the sun god, who's controlling the sun planet and the sunshine. Yeah. But anyway, here, the sunshine, the surface of the sun, and then actually going into the sun and seeing what the sun is composed of. So that's the most advanced level. Prabhupada says at the end of this paragraph, the sunshine, the sun disk, and the inner affairs of the sun planet cannot be separated from one another. And yet the students of the three different phases are not in the same category. Then in the next paragraph, Prabhupada discusses the term Bhagavan. What does this Bhagavan term mean? Who is Krishna as Bhagavan? What is he as Bhagavan? So, Prabhupada mentions it's explained by Parashara Muni. This is actually in Vishnu Purana, that Bhagavan means the Supreme Personality who possesses all riches, all strength, all fame, all beauty, all knowledge, and all renunciation. This is Bhagavan. And there are many people who are very rich, powerful, beautiful, famous, learned, and detached, but who can claim they have all of those things? No one can make that claim at all. But only Krishna can claim like that. Even Prabhupada mentions here in this paragraph, even Lord Narayan can't say that. In Nectar of Devotion, there are the 64 qualities of Krishna. Narayan only has 60 of them. Brahma, Shiva, they have less. So only Krishna fully possesses all qualities, all opulences. And therefore, he is the supreme absolute truth. Ishvara Parama Krishna, Satchidananda Vigraha, Anadya Adya Govinda, Sarva Karana Karana. Verses quoted here in this paragraph. There are many personalities possessing the qualities of Bhagavan, but Krishna is the supreme because none can excel him. He is the supreme person, and his body is eternal, full of knowledge and bliss. He is the primeval Lord Govinda, and the cause of all causes, including he is the cause of Narayan. What to speak of being the cause of Lord Brahma and Lord Shiva, he is the cause of Lord Narayan. So he is the cause of all causes. And just to make everything complete, Prabhupada cites the famous verse from Bhagavatam 1.3.28, in which it is pointed out that Krishna is the supreme form of the absolute truth. Ete changsa kalapumsa Krishnastu Bhagavan Swayam. All the lists of the incarnations of Godhead submitted herewith are either plenary expansions or parts of the plenary expansions of the Supreme Godhead. But Krishna is the Supreme Personality of Godhead himself. So Prabhupada really gets into that. And then Prabhupada concludes, it's really pretty extensive purport. Prabhupada concludes by referring to Krishna's not appreciating the lamentation of Arjuna. He asks him, Kuta, where from? Where from have these contaminations come? All these bodily considerations, very sentimental, foolish considerations, ignorant considerations, where have they come from? They can't have come from your background as a Kshatriya, because Kshatriya means you're twice born. You're an educated person. You know about these things. So where from has it come? And he refers to him as Anarya, Anarya Jushtam, that this is not symptomatic of being an Aryan, means a cultured person, a spiritually minded person. Actually, these are just symptomatic of a Sudra, symptomatic of a Sudra. So Prabhupada, let's just read how Prabhupada concludes the purport. Such deviation from duty does not help one in the progress of spiritual life, nor does it even give one the opportunity to become famous in this world. Lord Krishna did not approve of the so-called compassion of Arjuna for his kinsmen. Hare Krishna. We will continue on with verse 3 tomorrow. Shri Shri Radharanath, Shri Giri Govardhan, Shri Caitanya Mahaprabhu, Shri Shri Baladev Ji Ki Jai. Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai.